Hey guys, picture this. You're a perfectly respectable early human, minding your own business, trying not to get eaten by a saber-toothed cat, and suddenly, bam, some French guy in the 1800s decides to name your entire species after a random cave where a few of your unfortunate relatives happen to die. Welcome to the absurd world of paleoanthropology, where one discovery can doom an entire branch of humanity to eternal confusion. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. So here we are, about to unravel one of the most deliciously ridiculous naming disasters in the history of human classification. The tale of Cro-Magnon versus Homo Sapiens, a story so beautifully twisted that it would make Shakespeare weep with envy if Shakespeare had any interest in prehistoric taxonomy, which, let's be honest, he probably didn't. But first, let's set the scene. Imagine living 35,000 years ago. No Netflix, no pizza delivery, no central heating. Just you, your animal skin outfit that probably smelled like a wet dog that had rolled in rotting fish, and the constant nagging fear that literally everything around you wanted to kill you. The weather wanted to freeze you solid. Predators wanted to turn you into lunch. Diseases wanted to liquefy your organs. And even your own tribe members might decide you look particularly tasty during those long winter months when the mammoths were being uncooperatively scarce. Now, in this delightful paradise of perpetual terror, our protagonists lived their lives. They were anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, just like you and me, except they had the misfortune of existing before the invention of antibiotics, agriculture, or basic sanitation. These poor souls were essentially running the same biological hardware we have today, but with absolutely none of the software updates that make modern life bearable. And here's where our story gets truly, magnificently absurd. Fast forward about 33,000 years to 1868. The setting, southwestern France, in a region called the Dordogne, where the countryside is dotted with limestone cliffs riddled with caves like Swiss cheese made by a particularly enthusiastic giant. French workers are busy building a railway line, because nothing says progress like laying tracks through some of the most archaeologically significant real estate in human history. Enter our unwitting villain, a railway worker whose name history has mercifully forgotten, probably because he was too busy complaining about his back to realize he was about to trigger one of the most confusing naming conventions in scientific history. This fellow was digging away, dreaming perhaps of his evening meal of bread and whatever passed for cheese in 1868, when his shovel struck something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Bones. Human bones. Very, very old human bones. Now, you might think this would be cause for celebration, a magnificent scientific discovery. But remember, this is 1868, when the idea that humans had existed for more than a few thousand years was still considered borderline heretical by many. The concept of deep time, of humans living alongside extinct megafauna, was so new and radical that it made people's heads spin faster than a medieval torture device. The railway worker, being a practical sort, probably spent about 3 seconds wondering if he should report this find, before realizing that stopping work meant no pay, and no pay meant no food. So he did what any sensible person would do. He called his supervisor and made it someone else's problem. Word of the discovery eventually reached the ears of Louis Lartet, a geologist and paleontologist who had apparently decided that spelunking through ancient caves was a more appealing career choice than whatever respectable profession his father had in mind for him. Lartet arrived at the site with all the enthusiasm of a child on Christmas morning, if Christmas morning involved digging through millennia-old sediment and reassembling the shattered remains of long-dead humans. The cave where the bones were found was located near a rock shelter called Cro-Magnon. Now, Cro-Magnon sounds wonderfully exotic and scientific, doesn't it? It conjures images of ancient wisdom and primitive nobility. But the reality is far more mundane and, frankly, hilarious. Cro-Magnon simply means big hole in the local dialect. That's right. We've named an entire category of early humans after what essentially translates to the big hole where we found some dead people. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine if aliens discovered the remains of modern humans in, say, a McDonald's, and then decided to call our entire species McDonald's humans for the rest of eternity. That's essentially what happened here, except with more limestone and fewer Happy Meals. Lartet and his colleagues examined the remains and made a startling discovery. These weren't the brutish, ape-like creatures that many had expected early humans to be. These were tall, robust individuals with large brains, sophisticated tools, and evidence of complex cultural behaviors. They had created art, crafted elaborate tools, and had apparently figured out how to survive in an environment that would have killed modern humans within about 15 minutes. But here's where the story takes its most delicious turn into scientific absurdity. The researchers, in their infinite wisdom, decided that these remains represented a distinct type of early human. They coined the term Cro-Magnon man to describe what they believed was a specific population or subspecies of ancient humans. The name stuck like prehistoric tar, spreading through scientific literature and popular consciousness with the persistence of a particularly stubborn parasite. What makes this naming disaster so beautifully ironic is that these Cro-Magnon people were actually just Homo Sapiens, our own species. They weren't a separate type of human at all. They were simply our direct ancestors who had the misfortune of living in an era when survival required the kind of daily heroics that would make a Navy SEAL weep with exhaustion. Think about it. These were people dealing with ice ages, massive predators, and the constant threat of starvation, yet they still found time to paint elaborate cave murals that would make modern artists jealous. They crafted tools so sophisticated that archaeologists still struggle to replicate them. They developed complex social structures, trading networks that spanned continents, and belief systems that helped them make sense of a world that was actively trying to kill them every single day. And what do? We name them after a hole in the ground. The irony becomes even more delicious when you consider that these Cro-Magnon people were probably smarter, stronger, and more resourceful than most of us could ever hope to be. They had to memorize vast landscapes without maps, track animals across difficult terrain, craft everything they needed from raw materials, and maintain their tools in conditions that would challenge a modern survivalist with a full kit of equipment. But wait, the comedy of errors doesn't end there. As more discoveries were made across Europe, researchers started finding similar remains in other locations. Suddenly, there were Cro-Magnons popping up everywhere, like prehistoric mushrooms after a rain. Each new site added to the growing confusion about who these people were and how they related to modern humans. The scientific community found itself in the amusing position of having created a category for early humans that was both wildly popular and completely meaningless. Cro-Magnon became a household term, appearing in textbooks, documentaries, and popular media as a distinct type of early human. Children learned about Cro-Magnons as if they were a separate species, like Neanderthals or Homo erectus. Meanwhile, the actual scientific understanding was evolving rapidly. Researchers began to realize that these Cro-Magnons weren't fundamentally different from modern humans at all. They were simply early populations of Homo sapiens who had adapted to the harsh conditions of Ice Age Europe. Their robust build wasn't evidence of a separate species. It was the result of living in an environment where physical strength and endurance meant the difference between life and becoming a convenient snack for a cave bear. But try explaining that to a public that had already fallen in love with the romantic notion of the Cro-Magnon man. The name had taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of early human achievement and prehistoric nobility. It was far more appealing than the scientifically accurate but mundane early European Homo sapiens. And so, we arrive at one of the most enduring and confusing legacies in the study of human evolution, a name that refuses to die despite being scientifically obsolete. Cro-Magnon continues to appear in popular culture, often used interchangeably with caveman, or as a general term for early humans, much to the perpetual frustration of anthropologists who have spent decades trying to set the record straight. The real tragedy, or comedy, depending on your perspective, is that this naming confusion obscures the truly remarkable story of these early Europeans. These weren't primitive brutes living in caves because they didn't know any better. They were sophisticated survivors who had mastered one of the most challenging environments in human history. They lived through ice ages that would have wiped out our soft modern selves in a matter of days. Let me know in the comments if you've ever heard the term Cro-Magnon used incorrectly. I bet you have. It's everywhere, from movies to museums, perpetuating this beautiful scientific mix-up. These people developed technologies that we're still trying to fully understand. They created art that rivals anything produced in more recent millennia. They had complex burial practices that suggest sophisticated spiritual beliefs. They maintained social networks that allowed them to share information, resources, and genetic material across vast distances. In short, they were us, just tougher, more resourceful, and significantly better at staying alive in a world that was actively hostile to human existence. But instead of celebrating them as the remarkable ancestors they were, we've trapped them in a naming convention that suggests they were something other than fully modern humans. It's like calling medieval Europeans castle people, and then spending centuries debating whether they were actually human or just some kind of stone-dwelling subspecies. The persistence of the Cro-Magnon designation also reveals something fascinating about how scientific knowledge evolves, or in this case, how it sometimes gets stuck in linguistic amber. Once a term enters popular usage, it becomes incredibly difficult to dislodge, even when the scientific understanding that originally justified it has completely changed. This is the story of how a railway construction project, a limestone cave, and the all-too-human tendency to name things after the place where we find them created one of the most enduring misnomers in the study of human evolution. It's a tale of scientific progress hampered by the stubborn persistence of popular terminology, of public fascination with prehistoric romance, and of early humans who are probably far too busy surviving to worry about what future scientists might call them. As we delve deeper into this story, we'll explore how this naming disaster has shaped our understanding of human evolution, why it matters that we get these classifications right, and what the real lives of these remarkable Ice Age survivors were actually like. We'll discover how a simple case of mistaken identity became one of the most persistent myths in paleoanthropology. So buckle up for a journey through the twisted logic of scientific naming conventions, the harsh realities of prehistoric life, and the enduring power of a really catchy but completely misleading term. Because if there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that sometimes the biggest obstacles to understanding our past aren't the millennia that separate us from our ancestors. They're the names we give them when we finally dig them up. Now that we've established how our ancestors got stuck with the scientific equivalent of being named after a pothole, let's dive into what their actual lives were like. Because if you thought modern life was stressful, wait until you hear about the daily horror show that was existence 35,000 years ago. Picture waking up every morning to a world where your biggest concern isn't traffic or your Wi-Fi connection, but whether that rustling in the bushes is breakfast, or whether you're about to become breakfast. These so-called Cro-Magnons, and yes, I'm going to keep using that ridiculous name because it's stuck like prehistoric gum on humanity's shoe, lived in a world where absolutely everything was trying to kill them with the enthusiasm of a particularly motivated serial killer. Let's start with the weather, shall we? The last glacial maximum was in full swing, which is scientists speak for the entire world had decided to cosplay as a freezer. Temperatures were regularly 20 degrees Celsius colder than today. To put that in perspective, if you lived in Paris, your local climate would have felt more like northern Siberia. And unlike modern Siberians, these people didn't have the luxury of imported food, central heating, or the option to move somewhere warmer for vacation. The landscape of Ice Age Europe resembled what you might get if you took the most inhospitable parts of Alaska, removed all the modern conveniences, and then added a generous helping of enormous temperamental megafauna with a taste for human flesh. Imagine stepping outside your cave, and yes, they actually did live in caves, not because they were primitive, but because when your housing options are freezing stone shelter or certain death by exposure, caves start looking pretty appealing, and seeing woolly mammoths, cave bears, and saber-toothed cats treating your neighborhood like their personal all-you-can-eat buffet. The woolly mammoth, despite being fuzzy and appearing cuddly in children's books, was basically a 4-meter-tall, 6-ton tank with anger management issues and tusks that could impale a small car. These weren't gentle giants peacefully munching on grass. They were massive, unpredictable herbivores with the temperament of a modern elephant having the worst possible day, except they were adapted to survive in conditions that would kill a modern elephant within hours. But wait, there's more. Share in the comments which prehistoric predator you think would be the absolute worst to encounter. I'm curious about your nightmares. The cave bear was perhaps even more terrifying than it sounds, which is saying something because cave bear already sounds like something invented by a particularly sadistic dungeon master. These weren't your average forest bears. Cave bears were massive creatures that could reach 3.5 meters in length and weigh up to 1,000 kilograms. They had skulls the size of coffee tables and teeth that could crack bones like we crack walnuts. And unlike modern bears, which generally prefer to avoid humans, cave bears shared the same caves that our ancestors desperately needed for shelter. Imagine having roommates who could literally eat you, never cleaned up after themselves, and had absolutely no concept of personal space or property rights. The saber-toothed cat, meanwhile, was evolution's answer to the question, how can we make hunting humans even more efficient? These weren't just big cats with impressive dental work. They were precision killing machines with canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long, designed specifically for puncturing the throats of large prey. And guess what qualified as large prey? That's right, humans. These cats were patient, intelligent hunters who could track their victims for days, waiting for the perfect moment to turn someone's evening stroll into a very brief and extremely unpleasant experience. Now, let's talk about the daily routine of survival that would make a modern Navy SEAL training program look like a relaxing spa weekend. These people didn't have the luxury of specialization that we take for granted today. There was no going to the grocery store, calling a repair service, or ordering takeout. Every single thing they needed to survive had to be found, made, or killed by their own hands. Food acquisition was a full-time job with benefits that included not starving to death and possibly living until tomorrow. Hunting wasn't a recreational activity or a way to bond with nature. It was a desperate, dangerous necessity. These people had to track and kill animals that were bigger, stronger, and often more aggressive than they were, using weapons that were essentially pointed sticks and sharp rocks, held together with wishful thinking and plant fibers. The process of hunting a woolly mammoth, for instance, required the kind of coordination and bravery that would make a modern military operation look simple. Groups of hunters would spend days tracking these massive creatures, studying their behavior patterns and waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack. The actual hunt involved getting close enough to these enormous, unpredictable animals to thrust spears into vital organs while avoiding being trampled, gored, or flung into the next valley like a prehistoric rag doll. And if they successfully killed a mammoth, which was far from guaranteed, the real work began. They had to butcher several tons of meat using stone tools, preserve what they could for future use, and somehow transport the edible portions back to their camp before scavengers arrived to claim their prize. Remember, there were no refrigerators, no preservatives, and no way to store food long-term except by smoking, drying, or freezing it in the natural deep freeze of the Ice Age landscape. But hunting wasn't the only source of food. These resourceful survivors were also gatherers, foragers, and opportunistic scavengers who could extract nutrition from sources that would make a modern survivalist weep with admiration. They collected nuts, berries, roots, and various plant materials, but in an environment where edible vegetation was scarce and often buried under meters of snow for months at a time. They learned to identify which plants were safe to eat and which would kill them faster than a saber-toothed cat attack. They discovered how to extract nutrients from bone marrow, how to make the most of every part of an animal, and how to find sustenance in the harshest conditions imaginable. Waste wasn't just inefficient, it was potentially fatal. Toolmaking was another full-time occupation that required skills we can barely comprehend today. Every implement they used had to be crafted from raw materials using other tools that they had also made from raw materials. They were essentially running a complete manufacturing economy with technology that hadn't advanced beyond hit rocks together until something sharp comes out. Their stone tools were marvels of prehistoric engineering that modern craftspeople struggle to replicate even with detailed knowledge of the techniques involved. These weren't crude, roughly chipped rocks. They were sophisticated implements created through a complex process that required deep understanding of stone fracture mechanics, careful selection of raw materials, and countless hours of skilled labor. The process of making a single spear point could take several days of focused work. First, they had to find the right type of stone, which often meant traveling considerable distances to reach specific quarries where suitable materials could be found. Then came the delicate process of knapping, carefully striking the stone with other tools to remove flakes and gradually shape the desired implement. One wrong strike could ruin hours of work, and in a world where broken tools could mean the difference between successful hunting and starvation, precision was literally a matter of life and death. But stone tools were just the beginning. They also had to create handles, bindings, and hafting materials that would securely attach their carefully crafted points to spears, arrows, and other weapons. This required knowledge of plant fibers, animal sinews, and adhesives that could be extracted from various natural sources. They had to understand which materials would remain flexible in sub-freezing temperatures, which would maintain their strength when wet, and which combinations would provide the durability needed for repeated use in life or death situations. Let me know in the comments what modern convenience you think would have saved the most lives in the Ice Age. My money's on antibiotics. Speaking of life or death situations, let's discuss the medical realities of Ice Age life, which were approximately as pleasant as they sound. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no painkillers, and certainly no emergency services. If you broke a bone, contracted an infection, or suffered a serious injury, your treatment options were limited to whatever herbal remedies your group had discovered through generations of trial and error, most of which probably involved significant amounts of error and unfortunate outcomes. Archaeological evidence shows that these people did develop surprisingly sophisticated medical knowledge. They performed successful amputations, treated complex fractures, and even conducted what appears to be primitive surgery. But the survival rate for serious medical emergencies was undoubtedly grim by modern standards. A simple infected cut could become a death sentence, and conditions that we treat routinely today, appendicitis, pneumonia, or complicated childbirths, were often fatal. The psychological stress of this existence is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. These people lived with the constant awareness that death could come at any moment, from any direction, for any reason. They watched friends and family members die from injuries that would be minor inconveniences today. They experienced the loss of children to diseases and accidents that modern medicine prevents or treats easily. Yet somehow, incredibly, they didn't just survive. They thrived. They developed complex social structures that allowed them to cooperate effectively in hunting, child-rearing, and resource sharing. They created art that reveals sophisticated symbolic thinking and aesthetic sensibilities. They developed belief systems that helped them cope with the harsh realities of their existence, and provided frameworks for understanding their place in a dangerous world. The cave paintings they left behind aren't just pretty pictures. They're evidence of minds that could think abstractly, plan for the future, and find meaning in beauty even while surrounded by constant threats. These paintings show detailed knowledge of animal behavior, sophisticated understanding of proportion and movement, and artistic skills that rival anything produced in more recent millennia. They also developed complex burial practices that suggest beliefs about death, afterlife, and the continuation of identity beyond physical existence. Archaeological sites reveal carefully arranged burials with grave goods, ritual positioning of bodies, and evidence of ceremonial activities that must have provided psychological comfort to people facing daily mortality. The social cooperation required for survival in this environment was extraordinary. Hunting large game required coordinated group effort, with individuals willing to risk their lives for the benefit of the entire group. Child-rearing was clearly a communal responsibility, as evidenced by the survival of individuals with disabilities who would have required community support to reach adulthood. The sharing of knowledge about tool-making, hunting techniques, and environmental hazards was essential for group survival, and must have created complex social bonds and obligations. But perhaps most remarkably, these people weren't just surviving. They were expanding, exploring, and adapting to new environments with remarkable success. During this period, modern humans were spreading across continents, developing new technologies, and establishing populations in environments that had never supported human life before. They were pioneers in the truest sense, pushing the boundaries of human possibility not out of curiosity or adventure, but out of the desperate necessity of finding new resources and avoiding environmental catastrophes. The irony of calling these remarkable people Cro-Magnons, essentially people from the big hole, becomes even more absurd when you consider the incredible complexity of their lives and achievements. These weren't primitive brutes stumbling through a hostile world. They were sophisticated survivors whose daily existence required skills, knowledge, and courage that would challenge any modern human. They were us, essentially, running the same biological software we use today, but in an operating environment so hostile that it makes our modern complaints about traffic jams, slow internet, and long lines at coffee shops seem laughably trivial. They had our intelligence, our capacity for love and loss, our ability to create beauty and meaning, but they exercised these human qualities while facing challenges that would have eliminated our species if they hadn't been so remarkably adaptable and resilient. And yet, thanks to the whims of 19th century naming conventions, We remember them primarily as inhabitants of a hole in the ground, rather than as the extraordinary ancestors they actually were. So here we are, well into the 20th century, and the scientific community is starting to realize they might have made a tiny mistake. And by tiny mistake, I mean they've spent decades enthusiastically promoting a classification system that's about as scientifically accurate as calling all birds tree things, because someone once found a sparrow in an oak. The gradual awakening to the Cro-Magnon naming disaster is a masterpiece of academic stubbornness, institutional inertia, and the breathtaking human capacity to double down on errors rather than admit that maybe, just maybe, naming an entire category of early humans after a limestone cave wasn't the most brilliant taxonomic decision in scientific history. Picture the scene. It's the early 1900s, and anthropologists across Europe are making discoveries that should have immediately raised red flags about the whole Cro-Magnon business. They're finding similar remains in Spain, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere, remains that are clearly the same type of human, but have absolutely no connection to that famous big hole in southwestern France. Yet somehow, instead of questioning whether Cro-Magnon was an appropriate name for all these geographically dispersed populations, they doubled down with the enthusiasm of a gambler convinced that the next card will definitely save their mortgage. The scientific literature of this period reads like a comedy of errors written by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humor. Researchers were discovering Cro-Magnon-type remains, Cro-Magnon-like specimens, and probable Cro-Magnons from locations that were hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from the original site. It was like finding a McDonald's cup in Tokyo and deciding that all Japanese people should be called McDonald's-type humans. But the real comedy wasn't just in the naming, it was in the elaborate intellectual gymnastics that scientists performed to justify why this made sense. They developed complex theories about Cro-Magnon migrations, Cro-Magnon expansion, and Cro-Magnon cultural influence that treated these people as if they were some sort of distinct species or subspecies spreading across Europe like a particularly successful prehistoric franchise operation. The irony was delicious. The more evidence they found that these Cro-Magnons were anatomically identical to modern humans, the more elaborate their explanations became for why they deserved a separate designation. It was as if they had painted themselves into a taxonomic corner and decided that the best solution was to redecorate the entire room rather than admit they had started with the wrong color. Meanwhile, the technology for analyzing human remains was advancing rapidly, and each new technique made it clearer that these Cro-Magnons were not meaningfully different from modern Homo Sapiens. Detailed cranial measurements showed that their brain sizes, skull shapes, and facial features fell well within the range of variation seen in contemporary human populations. Their skeletal proportions, muscle attachment points, and limb measurements were entirely consistent with modern human anatomy. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been in a situation where admitting you were wrong seemed harder than continuing to be wrong? The scientific community was living this nightmare on a professional scale. But here's where the story gets truly magnificent in its absurdity. Rather than acknowledging that Cro-Magnon was simply a geographic designation that had been mistakenly elevated to taxonomic status, many researchers began developing increasingly elaborate explanations for why these people were somehow special, despite being anatomically modern humans. Some proposed that Cro-Magnons represented the earliest modern humans in Europe, as if being among the first Homo sapiens to reach a particular continent somehow made them a distinct category worthy of their own name. Others suggested that they were Proto-Europeans or founding populations that deserved special recognition for their pioneering role in European prehistory. It was like arguing that the first person to move to New York should be classified as a separate subspecies of human because they arrived before everyone else. The most creative explanations involved cultural and behavioral differences. Researchers argued that Cro-Magnons had distinctive tool-making traditions, artistic styles, and social practices that set them apart from other early modern humans. This was true to some extent. Different populations did develop different cultural adaptations, but it's no more reason to create a separate human category than the fact that modern Japanese and Brazilian cultures are different justifies calling them separate species. The persistence of the Cro-Magnon designation also revealed some uncomfortable truths about the scientific community's relationship with popular culture and public expectations. The term had become deeply embedded in textbooks, museum displays, and popular media. Cro-Magnon man was a household name, synonymous with early human achievement and prehistoric sophistication. Millions of people had learned about human evolution through the lens of this classification system. Changing course would have required admitting that decades of education, research, and public outreach had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. It would have meant rewriting textbooks, redesigning museum exhibits, and explaining to a confused public why scientists were suddenly abandoning a term that had seemed perfectly scientific and legitimate for generations. So instead of taking their medicine and correcting the error, many in the scientific community chose the path of least resistance. They kept using the term while gradually, almost imperceptibly changing its definition. Cro-Magnon evolved from meaning a distinct type of early human to meaning early modern humans in Europe, to eventually meaning any anatomically modern humans from the Upper Paleolithic period. This semantic evolution was a masterpiece of academic face-saving. It allowed scientists to continue using familiar terminology while slowly backing away from the implications that had originally made the term problematic. It was like gradually changing the definition of bird from things with feathers that fly to things with feathers, to things that might have had feathers at some point, to eventually anything we've traditionally called a bird. The process was so gradual that many researchers probably didn't even realize they were participating in a collective abandonment of scientific precision. Papers continued to be published about Cro-Magnon populations and Cro-Magnon culture, but the meaning of these terms became increasingly vague and geographically meaningless. By the mid-20th century, the situation had become thoroughly ridiculous. Different researchers were using Cro-Magnon to mean different things, often within the same publication. Some used it to refer specifically to the original French remains, others applied it to any European early modern humans, and still others used it as a general synonym for anatomically modern humans from the late Pleistocene period. Students of anthropology found themselves in the bizarre situation of learning about Cro-Magnons without ever receiving a clear, consistent definition of what the term actually meant. Textbooks would describe Cro-Magnon characteristics, behavior, and cultural achievements, while carefully avoiding the question of how these people were actually different from other contemporary Homo sapiens populations. The confusion was compounded by the fact that many of the most famous Cro-Magnon discoveries were actually quite atypical of early modern humans in general. The original remains from the Cro-Magnon site, for instance, included some particularly robust individuals who were taller and more muscular than average. This led to persistent stereotypes about Cro-Magnons being exceptionally large and strong, even though these characteristics were probably just individual variation rather than population-wide traits. Museum displays perpetuated these misconceptions by showcasing the most impressive Cro-Magnon specimens while ignoring the many more typical examples that didn't fit the heroic narrative. Visitors to natural history museums could easily come away with the impression that all Cro-Magnons were towering, magnificently muscled specimens of prehistoric humanity, when in reality, they showed the same range of physical variation as any human population. The artistic reconstructions were even more problematic. Paleo-artists, working with limited and often biased information, created images of Cro-Magnon man that emphasized their supposed distinctiveness from modern humans. These reconstructions often exaggerated primitive features while downplaying the essential modernity of their anatomy. The result was a visual representation of early humans that was both scientifically inaccurate and culturally misleading. Meanwhile, the actual scientific understanding of human evolution was advancing rapidly in directions that made the Cro-Magnon classification increasingly obsolete. Genetic research was revealing the complex patterns of human migration and population mixing that had shaped modern human diversity. Archaeological discoveries were showing that the behavioral and cultural innovations traditionally attributed to Cro-Magnons had actually developed gradually across multiple populations and geographic regions. The emerging picture of human evolution was far more complex and interesting than the simple narrative of distinct early human types that had dominated 19th and early 20th century thinking. Modern humans hadn't evolved as separate, clearly defined subspecies that could be neatly categorized and labeled. Instead, they had developed as interconnected populations that shared genes, technologies, and cultural innovations across vast geographic networks. This new understanding made geographic designations like Cro-Magnon seem not just inaccurate, but actively misleading. They implied a level of population distinctiveness that simply hadn't existed in prehistoric reality. Early modern humans were more like members of an extended family, who had spread across different continents while maintaining contact and occasionally intermarrying, rather than separate branches of humanity that had developed in isolation. Yet despite this growing understanding, the Cro-Magnon terminology proved remarkably resistant to change. It had become what linguists call a fossilized term, a piece of language that continues to exist long after the original justification for its usage has disappeared. Like dialing a phone number or filming with a digital camera, Cro-Magnon persisted because people understood what it meant in general terms, even if the specific technical meaning had become obsolete. The persistence was also helped by the fact that abandoning the term would have required acknowledging just how wrong the scientific community had been for so long. It's one thing to correct a minor classification error or update a technical definition. It's quite another to admit that a fundamental organizing principle of human evolutionary studies had been based on a mistake that should have been obvious from the beginning. What's your take on how long it takes for scientific communities to admit major mistakes? Share your thoughts in the comments. I think this story shows it can take generations. By the 1970s and 1980s, the more honest members of the anthropological community were starting to openly discuss the problems with Cro-Magnon terminology. Academic papers began appearing with titles like The Cro-Magnon Problem and Rethinking Cro-Magnon Classification, which were scientific speak for, "We've been doing this wrong for a century, and maybe it's time to talk about it." These papers carefully outlined the historical development of the term, the lack of scientific justification for treating Cro-Magnons as a distinct category, and the confusion that the terminology had created in both academic and popular understanding of human evolution. They proposed various solutions, from completely abandoning the term to redefining it in more geographically specific ways. But change in academic terminology moves at approximately the speed of continental drift, especially when the terminology in question has become embedded in decades of research, education, and popular culture. The Cro-Magnon designation had achieved a kind of institutional immortality that made it nearly impossible to kill, even when everyone involved agreed that it needed to die. The result was a kind of scientific purgatory where Cro-Magnon continued to appear in academic literature, museum displays, and educational materials, but with increasingly vague meanings and careful disclaimers about its limitations. It became a zombie term, technically dead, but still shambling around the landscape of human evolutionary studies, causing confusion and perpetuating misconceptions wherever it appeared. And this, dear viewers, brings us to the modern era, where we're still dealing with the consequences of a naming decision made by French railway workers and 19th century paleontologists who thought they were being perfectly reasonable when they decided to name early humans after a hole in the ground. Welcome to the modern era, where we have smartphones that can access the entirety of human knowledge in seconds, but we're still collectively confused about whether our 35,000-year-old ancestors were a different species because some French guys found bones in a hole and decided to name an entire branch of humanity after their discovery location. If that's not a perfect metaphor for the human condition, I don't know what is. The persistence of Cro-Magnon confusion in the 21st century is like watching a game of scientific telephone that's been going on for over 150 years, where each generation of researchers, educators, and content creators has slightly garbled the message until we've arrived at a situation where nobody's quite sure what we're talking about, but everyone's too invested in the conversation to stop. Let's start with the internet, that magnificent repository of human knowledge and misinformation in roughly equal proportions. A quick search for Cro-Magnon will return thousands of results that confidently describe these early humans as if they were a distinct species, subspecies, or at least a meaningfully different population from modern Homo sapiens. Websites ranging from educational institutions to popular science blogs continue to perpetuate the myth with the enthusiasm of conspiracy theorists spreading theories about ancient aliens. You'll find articles explaining the differences between Cro-Magnons and modern humans, complete with detailed comparisons of physical characteristics, cultural practices, and behavioral traits. These articles treat the comparison as if it makes perfect sense, like comparing lions and tigers, rather than what it actually is, comparing early Europeans to modern humans, which is roughly equivalent to comparing medieval French people to contemporary Parisians, and concluding they must be different species because one group used swords and the other uses smartphones. The visual representations are even more problematic. Stock photos and educational illustrations continue to depict Cro-Magnon man as a distinct type of early human, usually shown alongside Neanderthals and various species of Homo erectus, as if they're all different branches of the human family tree. These images reinforce the misconception that Cro-Magnons represent a separate evolutionary stage, rather than simply being our direct ancestors, who had the misfortune of living in an era before central heating and antibiotics. Museums, those bastions of educational accuracy, have found themselves in the awkward position of trying to modernize their displays, while not completely confusing visitors who arrive expecting to learn about Cro-Magnon man, because that's what they learned in school 30 years ago. The result is often a compromise that satisfies nobody, displays that mention Cro-Magnons while carefully hedging about what the term actually means, creating educational experiences that are about as clear as mud mixed with prehistoric sediment. The natural history museums of the world have developed a fascinating variety of approaches to this problem. Some have quietly retired the term altogether, referring instead to early modern humans in Europe or Upper Paleolithic Homo Sapiens. Others have kept the term but surrounded it with so many qualifications and explanations that visitors need a doctorate in anthropology to understand what they're looking at. Still others have embraced the confusion, creating displays that simultaneously use and critique the terminology in a postmodern approach to museum education that would make a philosophy professor weep with joy. Tell me in the comments, have you ever visited a museum and left more confused than when you arrived? The Cro-Magnon situation is a perfect example of how this happens. The educational system has been particularly slow to adapt, partly because changing curriculum is like trying to turn around an aircraft carrier using a canoe paddle. Textbooks that were written decades ago continue to be reprinted, with minor updates that somehow manage to avoid addressing the fundamental classification problem. Students learn about human evolution through a lens that includes Cro-Magnons as a distinct category, then arrive at universities to discover that their professors are using completely different terminology. The result is generations of students who have learned contradictory information about human evolution without anyone bothering to explain why the contradictions exist. It's like teaching geography using maps from the 1800s and then acting surprised when students are confused about why Yugoslavia doesn't appear in modern atlases. High school biology textbooks are particularly guilty of perpetuating the confusion. They often include timelines of human evolution that show Cro-Magnon man as a discrete step between earlier human species and modern Homo sapiens, creating the visual impression that these were our immediate predecessors rather than our direct ancestors. Students understandably conclude that Cro-Magnons must have been fundamentally different from us, because why else would they get their own section in the human evolution chapter? The popular media has embraced the Cro-Magnon designation with the uncritical enthusiasm that characterizes most of their science coverage. Documentaries about human evolution routinely feature dramatic reenactments of Cro-Magnon life, complete with actors portraying these early humans as if they were members of a distinct species, rather than people who were essentially identical to modern humans except for their complete lack of Netflix and indoor plumbing. These documentaries often emphasize the supposed physical differences between Cro-Magnons and modern humans, focusing on their robust build, prominent brow ridges, and muscular development, while downplaying the fact that these characteristics were simply adaptations to a harsh environment, rather than evidence of evolutionary distinction. It's like making a documentary about Inuit people and concluding they must be a different species because they're adapted to Arctic conditions. The entertainment industry has been even more creative in its interpretation of Cro-Magnon identity. Movies and television shows routinely use Cro-Magnon as a synonym for caveman or primitive human, often in contexts that have nothing to do with actual prehistoric European populations. Characters are described as Cro-Magnon to indicate that they're unsophisticated, brutish, or intellectually limited, which is both scientifically inaccurate and culturally insulting to our remarkably sophisticated ancestors. This popular usage has created a feedback loop where the term Cro-Magnon has acquired connotations that are completely divorced from any scientific meaning. It's become a cultural shorthand for primitive behavior, despite the fact that the actual Cro-Magnons were sophisticated survivors who accomplished technological and artistic feats that would challenge modern humans. The internet has also given rise to a fascinating subculture of amateur anthropologists and evolution enthusiasts who have developed their own elaborate theories about Cro-Magnon identity. Online forums and social media groups discuss Cro-Magnon genetics, Cro-Magnon survival skills, and Cro-Magnon spirituality, as if these topics represent coherent fields of study rather than category errors based on obsolete terminology. These communities often develop increasingly complex explanations for supposed differences between Cro-Magnons and modern humans, incorporating everything from alternative archaeology to pseudoscientific theories about human cognitive evolution. The discussions can be remarkably detailed and passionate, despite being based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what Cro-Magnons actually were. The persistence of these communities reveals something important about human psychology. Once we've learned a particular way of categorizing the world, we're remarkably resistant to changing our mental models, even when presented with contradictory evidence. The idea of Cro-Magnon man as a distinct type of early human has become so embedded in popular consciousness that it continues to generate interest and discussion long after its scientific utility has expired. Meanwhile, actual anthropologists find themselves in the frustrating position of constantly explaining why the terminology that everyone else is using is problematic. They've developed a variety of strategies for dealing with this situation, ranging from patient education to resigned acceptance, to occasional outbursts of academic frustration that make it into peer-reviewed journals with titles like The Persistence of Obsolete Terminology in Public Understanding of Human Evolution. Some researchers have attempted to co-opt the term by redefining it in more scientifically accurate ways. They use Cro-Magnon to refer specifically to early modern human populations in Europe during a particular time period, while carefully explaining that this doesn't imply any fundamental biological differences from other contemporary human populations. This approach has the advantage of working with existing public understanding rather than against it, but it also risks perpetuating the confusion by continuing to use terminology that implies distinctiveness. Others have taken a more confrontational approach, actively campaigning against the use of Cro-Magnon terminology in educational and popular contexts. They argue that continuing to use the term, even with qualifications, reinforces misconceptions about human evolution and makes it harder for the public to understand the actual scientific consensus about early modern humans. The debate within the scientific community reflects broader tensions about how to communicate complex scientific information to a public that has already formed strong opinions based on incomplete or outdated information. It's a problem that extends far beyond anthropology. Climate scientists face similar challenges with terminology around global warming. Biologists struggle with misconceptions about evolution, and physicists despair over popular misunderstandings of quantum mechanics. But the Cro-Magnon situation is particularly frustrating because the misconception is so easily corrected. Unlike complex scientific theories that require extensive education to understand properly, the Cro-Magnon classification error can be explained in a single sentence. They were just early modern humans who lived in Europe during the Ice Age. The fact that this simple correction has failed to penetrate public consciousness after decades of effort suggests something profound about the stickiness of scientific misinformation. The problem is compounded by the fact that the Cro-Magnon story is genuinely interesting and compelling. People are naturally fascinated by these early European populations who survived in harsh conditions while creating sophisticated art and technology. The romantic appeal of Cro-Magnon man as a category of noble prehistoric humans is hard to replace with the more prosaic reality of early modern European populations with regional cultural adaptations. There's also a subtle cultural investment in maintaining the Cro-Magnon designation that goes beyond simple scientific accuracy. For many people, especially those of European descent, the idea of Cro-Magnon ancestors provides a connection to a heroic prehistoric past that feels more meaningful than simply being descendants of anatomically modern humans who happen to live in Europe. This cultural attachment to the terminology creates resistance to change that operates independently of scientific considerations. People don't want to give up their Cro-Magnon ancestors any more than they want to give up other appealing but inaccurate historical narratives. The correction feels like a loss rather than a gain in understanding. What other outdated scientific terms do you think have stuck around too long? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I bet there are more examples of this than we realize. The situation has been further complicated by the rise of genetic genealogy and direct-to-consumer DNA testing. Companies that analyze personal genetic information often include references to Cro-Magnon ancestry or Cro-Magnon markers in their reports, despite the fact that these terms are scientifically meaningless. You can't have Cro-Magnon genes any more than you can have medieval genes or Victorian genes. They're temporal and geographic designations, not biological categories. But customers who receive these reports often interpret them as evidence that they're descended from a distinct type of early human, reinforcing the misconception that Cro-Magnons were somehow different from other modern human populations. The companies, caught between scientific accuracy and customer expectations, often include disclaimers about the limitations of these designations while continuing to use the terminology that creates the confusion in the first place. The result is a feedback loop where commercial genetic testing reinforces popular misconceptions about human evolution, which in turn creates demand for more testing to discover ancient ancestry, which generates more misleading reports that perpetuate the original misconceptions. It's like a perpetual motion machine powered by scientific confusion. This brings us to perhaps the most ironic aspect of the entire Cro-Magnon situation. We now know more about the actual lives, genetics, and cultural achievements of these early Europeans than the 19th century researchers who first named them could ever have imagined. We can analyze their DNA, reconstruct their diets, understand their social structures, and appreciate their technological innovations in ways that would have seemed like magic to Louis Lartet and his colleagues. Yet despite this incredible expansion of knowledge, we're still stuck with their arbitrary naming decision based on a single cave discovery. It's as if we've built a magnificent modern city but kept the street signs from the original settlement, creating constant confusion for anyone trying to navigate the current reality. And here we are, at the end of our journey through one of the most spectacular naming disasters in the history of human science. We've watched French railway workers accidentally trigger a classification catastrophe, followed Victorian-era scientists as they doubled down on their mistakes with admirable stubbornness, and observed modern society's remarkable ability to maintain confusion in the face of overwhelming evidence. If this story doesn't perfectly encapsulate the beautiful absurdity of human nature, nothing does. So what have we learned from this magnificent tale of scientific confusion, academic pride, and the stubborn persistence of a really bad naming decision? Well, first and foremost, we've discovered that calling early humans Cro-Magnons makes about as much sense as calling all modern Americans Grand Canyon people, because someone once found a few skeletons near a famous geological landmark. The deeper lesson here is both hilarious and profound. The story of Cro-Magnon versus Homo Sapiens isn't really about early humans at all. It's about us, modern humans, and our remarkable capacity to create problems out of thin air, then spend centuries elaborately avoiding the simple solutions that were obvious from the beginning. Think about it. We took a perfectly straightforward situation, early modern humans living in Ice Age Europe, and managed to turn it into a taxonomic nightmare that has confused students, misled the public, and frustrated scientists for over 150 years. All because some 19th century researchers couldn't resist the urge to name things after the places where they found them, like academic conquistadors planting flags in the territory of human classification. The real irony is that the actual story of these early Europeans is far more interesting than the confused narrative we've created around them. These weren't mysterious Cro-Magnon people who emerged from the mists of prehistory. They were us, literally us, dealing with challenges that would have killed most of us within days. They were running the same biological software we use today, but in an operating environment so hostile that it makes our worst Monday morning look like a luxury spa experience. They survived ice ages that would have flash-frozen our modern selves into prehistoric popsicles. They hunted animals that could have used us as toothpicks. They created art that still moves us today, using pigments they extracted from rocks and applying them by candlelight in caves while listening for the sounds of predators who considered human artists a delectable midnight snack. These people developed technologies we still struggle to replicate, maintained social networks that spanned continents, and passed down knowledge that allowed their descendants, us, to eventually invent agriculture, writing, and civilization itself. They were pioneers in the truest sense, pushing the boundaries of human survival not because they were different from us, but because they were exactly like us, just tougher, more resourceful, and significantly better at staying alive in a world that was actively trying to eliminate the human species. But instead of celebrating them as the remarkable ancestors they were, we got distracted by a naming convention that turned them into something other than fully human. We created an artificial category that suggested they were somehow different from us, when the truth is that they were us, just us without the benefit of modern medicine, agriculture, or indoor plumbing. Let me know in the comments what you think was the most ridiculous part of this whole naming disaster. There are so many candidates. The persistence of the Cro-Magnon designation reveals something fascinating about how humans relate to their own past. We seem to have a psychological need to create categories and classifications that make our ancestors feel safely distant from ourselves. We're comfortable thinking about Cro-Magnon man as a distinct type of early human because it allows us to maintain the illusion that we're fundamentally different from people who lived in caves and hunted mammoths. But the reality is far more unsettling and wonderful. Those people were us. If you could somehow transport a newborn from 35,000 years ago to the present day and raise them in a modern family, they would be indistinguishable from any other child. They would learn to read and write, use smartphones, go to university, and complain about traffic jams with exactly the same facility as anyone born today. Conversely, if you took a modern infant back to Ice Age Europe and somehow managed to keep them alive long enough to grow up in that environment, they would become exactly the kind of sophisticated prehistoric survivor that we romantically label as Cro-Magnon. They would learn to track animals across vast landscapes, craft tools from raw materials, and create art in cave walls, because those were the skills that environment demanded. The only real difference between us and our Cro-Magnon ancestors is opportunity, not biology. We had the incredible good fortune to be born into a world where previous generations had already solved the basic problems of survival, allowing us to focus on higher-level concerns like career advancement, relationship drama, and arguing about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. They had to start from scratch in an environment that would have killed us before we figured out how to make fire, let alone how to hunt woolly mammoths or survive European winters without modern clothing. The fact that they not only survived but thrived is testament to the remarkable adaptability and intelligence of our species, not some distinct category of early human. This brings us to perhaps the most important lesson of the entire Cro-Magnon saga. The way we classify and understand our past shapes how we think about ourselves in the present. By creating artificial categories that distance us from our ancestors, we lose sight of both their achievements and our own potential. When we think of Cro-Magnons as a separate type of early human, we diminish their accomplishments by treating them as something less than fully modern. But we also diminish ourselves by suggesting that we couldn't survive the challenges they faced, when the truth is that we have exactly the same biological capabilities they did. We've just never been forced to use them. The modern human sitting in a comfortable chair, reading this on a glowing screen, has the same brain that painted the caves at Lascaux, the same hands that crafted sophisticated stone tools, and the same capacity for cooperation and innovation that allowed our species to spread across the globe despite facing challenges that would make a modern disaster movie look like a children's cartoon. We are the descendants of people who survived the impossible, and we carry their genes, their intelligence, and their adaptability in every cell of our bodies. The only reason we don't live like them is that we don't have to, thanks to the accumulated knowledge and technology that they and countless generations of our ancestors developed through thousands of years of trial, error, and occasionally getting eaten by large predators. The Cro-Magnon naming disaster also illustrates how scientific knowledge evolves, or in this case, how it sometimes gets stuck in linguistic amber for far longer than anyone would prefer. The history of science is littered with terms, concepts, and classifications that made sense at the time, but became obsolete as understanding advanced. Usually these outdated ideas fade away naturally as new knowledge replaces old misconceptions. But sometimes, as in the case of Cro-Magnon terminology, a scientific concept becomes so embedded in popular culture that it develops a life independent of its original scientific justification. The term becomes a cultural artifact that persists long after its scientific utility has expired, creating a kind of intellectual fossil that continues to confuse people generations after it should have been retired. This phenomenon isn't unique to anthropology. Astronomy still deals with popular misconceptions about the solar system model of atoms, despite the fact that quantum mechanics made that visualization obsolete nearly a century ago. Biology struggles with persistent misunderstandings about evolution that stem from outdated concepts like the Great Chain of Being. Physics faces constant battles against misconceptions about relativity and quantum mechanics that were inaccurate from the moment they entered popular consciousness. The difference is that most of these other scientific misconceptions don't have names that sound as cool as Cro-Magnon. There's something romantically appealing about the term that makes people reluctant to give it up, even when they understand that it's scientifically meaningless. It sounds like the name of a noble prehistoric tribe, a category of ancient wisdom keepers, or a distinct branch of human development that represents our species at its most heroic and primitive? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think some scientific misconceptions stick around because they sound cooler than the accurate explanations? The truth, as usual, is both more complex and more interesting than the romantic fiction we've constructed around it. These early Europeans weren't noble savages living in harmony with nature. They were desperate survivors dealing with an environment that was trying to kill them every single day. They weren't primitive ancestors stumbling towards civilization. They were sophisticated problem solvers who developed technologies and cultural practices that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would eliminate our modern selves within hours. They weren't a separate category of early human deserving their own taxonomic designation. They were us, exactly us, demonstrating the remarkable capabilities of our species when pushed to the absolute limits of survival. Every innovation they developed, every artistic creation they left behind, every successful hunt that kept their children alive for another day, was accomplished using the same biological hardware that we carry today. The story of these misnamed ancestors also offers a kind of backhanded inspiration for modern humans, who sometimes feel overwhelmed by the challenges of contemporary life. When you're stuck in traffic, dealing with difficult co-workers, or struggling with the endless complexity of modern existence, it's worth remembering that you're descended from people who faced down saber-toothed cats before breakfast, and then spent the rest of the day tracking woolly mammoths across frozen landscapes while simultaneously inventing art, technology, and civilization. Your ancestors survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, diseases that would liquefy a modern emergency room, and predators that could swallow a smart car. They did this while maintaining complex social relationships, raising children, creating beauty, and gradually developing the knowledge base that would eventually allow their descendants to complain about slow Wi-Fi and argue about politics on social media. You carry their genes, their intelligence, and their remarkable capacity for adaptation and survival. The only reason you're not using these capabilities to hunt mammoths and paint caves is that previous generations solved those problems for you, freeing you up to tackle different challenges like climate change, space exploration, and figuring out how to make TikTok videos go viral. So the next time someone uses Cro-Magnon as an insult to suggest primitive thinking or brutish behavior, you can gently remind them that they're actually invoking the memory of some of the most sophisticated survivors in human history. These were people who accomplished technological and artistic feats that would challenge modern humans, while simultaneously dealing with environmental pressures that would have eliminated our species if they hadn't been so remarkably adaptable and intelligent. And if someone insists on using the term Cro-Magnon to describe early modern humans, you can smile knowingly and remember that they're essentially calling these remarkable ancestors people from the big hole, which is roughly equivalent to calling all modern New Yorkers people from the place with tall buildings, because someone once found human remains near the Empire State Building. In the end, the Great Cro-Magnon naming disaster teaches us that humans have always been human, capable of remarkable achievements and spectacular mistakes, often simultaneously. We are the species that survived the impossible while occasionally naming things after holes in the ground. We are the descendants of people who painted masterpieces by torchlight while listening for approaching predators, and we are the inheritors of a scientific tradition that sometimes gets so attached to its mistakes that it takes centuries to correct them. We are, in other words, exactly the kind of species that would create a taxonomic classification system based on where we happen to find some bones, then spend 150 years elaborately defending that decision instead of simply admitting that maybe, just maybe, we should have thought it through a bit more carefully from the beginning. And you know what? That's perfectly, beautifully, absurdly human. Our ancestors would understand completely. Thanks for joining me on this journey through one of the most delightfully ridiculous naming disasters in scientific history. Remember to hit that like button if you enjoyed our exploration of how French railway workers accidentally created a century and a half of confusion about human evolution. Subscribe for more stories about the magnificent ways humans manage to complicate the simplest things, and let me know in the comments what other scientific naming disasters you'd like to see covered. Until next time, remember, you're not descended from primitive cavemen, you're descended from sophisticated survivors who happen to live in caves, because that was the best housing option available in Ice Age Europe. And if that's not something to be proud of, I don't know what is.